There is a doll sitting behind glass in a museum in Key West, Florida. He's a little over 3 feet tall. He wears a sailor suit that's over 100 years old. His face is stitched, his eyes are dark, and if you look at him too long, people say he looks back. Thousands of visitors write him letters every year. Not out of love, out of fear. They apologize to him. They beg him not to curse their trip, their marriage, their health, their children. He has a name. He has a case file of incidents going back over a century. He has appeared on television, in books, and in the nightmares of people who swear they never even believed in ghosts before they met him. His name is Robert, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why grown adults are terrified of a child's toy. Before we start, if stories like this get under your skin the way they get under mine, subscribe and hit the bell because we cover a new true horror case every week. Now, let's meet Robert. To understand Robert, you have to go back to 1904 to a large yellow house on Eaton Street in Key West, Florida. This was the childhood home of a boy named Robert Eugene Otto. Everyone called him Gene to avoid confusing him with the doll that would later carry his first name. The Otto family was wealthy and well-established in Key West, and like most wealthy families of that era in the South, they employed domestic servants. One of these servants was a Bahamian woman hired to help raise young Gene. Accounts of what happened next vary depending on who's telling the story, and that's going to be a theme in this video because almost nothing about Robert's history is fully agreed upon. But the most common version goes like this. The Bahamian servant practiced folk magic. Some accounts call it obia, a spiritual tradition from the Caribbean, often lumped together inaccurately with Haitian voodoo in older, less culturally sensitive retellings. As a gift to young Gene, or possibly as a farewell gift when she left the household, she gave the boy a doll. The doll was stuffed with straw, had a hand-painted face, and was dressed fittingly in one of Gene's own childhood sailor suits. Gene named the doll after himself, Robert, and the two were inseparable. That, on its surface, is a sweet story. A boy and his toy. It's what happened next that made Key West talk. Neighbors and family friends began to notice something strange about young Gene's relationship with his doll. He talked to Robert constantly, which isn't unusual for a child with a favorite toy. What was unusual, according to accounts passed down through the Otto family and later documented by researchers and museum staff, was that Gene insisted Robert talked back. He would have full conversations with the doll, and people in the house said they sometimes heard a second, different voice answering Gene from his room, a voice that wasn't Gene's, even though no one else was in there. Servants reported hearing giggling at night that didn't belong to Gene. Furniture in the house was found rearranged, objects went missing, and whenever Gene was accused of misbehaving, breaking something, causing damage, his answer was always the same: Robert did it. At first, this was written off as classic childhood behavior. Kids blame imaginary friends and toys for things all the time. But according to the accounts collected by the Fort East Martello Museum, where Robert now lives, the pattern didn't fade as Gene got older. It got worse. Passers-by outside the home claimed to see the doll's expression change when they looked up at the window, appearing to move from window to window on its own throughout the day, as if it were watching them walk by. Gene's parents reportedly heard footsteps in the house at night that were too heavy to be their sons and too light to be an adult's. At first, this was written off as classic childhood behavior. Kids blame imaginary friends and toys for things all the time. But according to the accounts collected by the Fort East Martello Museum, where Robert now lives, the pattern didn't fade as Gene got older. It got worse. Passers-by outside the home claimed to see the doll's expression change when they looked up at the window, appearing to move from window to window on its own throughout the day, as if it were watching them walk by. Gene's parents reportedly heard footsteps in the house at night that were too heavy to be their sons and too light to be an adult's. Gene grew into adulthood, went away for periods of time, married a woman named Anne, and eventually inherited the family home. Robert didn't stay in a toy box. Robert got his own chair in the turret room of the house. Some accounts say Jean, now an adult, still spoke to the doll daily. Anne reportedly hated the doll. Family friends later claimed she pushed to have Robert placed in the attic, and that once he was up there, passers-by and later tenants would still report seeing the doll's silhouette in the attic window. Jean died in 1974. Robert stayed in the house. After Jean's death, the Otto house was sold. And this is where Robert's legend stopped being a private family story and became public record. Because the family who moved in had a 10-year-old daughter. She discovered Robert still sitting in the attic and, like any child, was delighted to have found an old toy in her new home. Her parents let her keep him in her room. Almost immediately, the girl began having night terrors. She told her parents that the doll moved around the room on his own at night. She said he tried to hurt her. She said she watched him actually climb, up furniture toward her bed. Her parents dismissed it, at first, as a child's overactive imagination reacting to an unfamiliar old house, until they said they witnessed some of it themselves. The girl's own descriptions, later relayed by the museum and by her own accounts as an adult decades later, described Robert's expression shifting from a neutral, almost pleasant look to a snarl, teeth bared, when no one else was around to see it happen except her. The family eventually gave Robert to the museum, reportedly relieved to have him out of the house. Robert has lived at the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West since the 1990s, sealed inside a glass case. And this is where the modern legend really exploded, because the museum started keeping something unusual, a filing cabinet full of letters. Visitors who take photographs of Robert without asking his permission, yes, you're meant to ask the doll's permission, have reported in writing an alarming and consistent pattern of bad luck afterward. Car accidents, job losses, divorces, illnesses, broken cameras. One of the most repeated claims is that people's cameras and phones simply stop working the moment they try to photograph him, only to work perfectly again the second they walk away. The museum receives hundreds of these letters every year, many enclosing gifts, money, or handwritten apologies, begging Robert to lift whatever curse the center believes they triggered. Museum staff read some of them aloud in a binder kept next to his case, so future visitors can see just how many people believe they've been punished. Staff members themselves have added to the legend. Cleaning crews have reported Robert's position shifting overnight inside a locked case. Museum workers have described sudden temperature drops directly in front of his case with no explainable source. And more than one staff member has said, on record, that Robert's expression looks different to them depending on the day. This is the part of the video I promised you. Every major theory, researchers, historians, paranormal investigators, and skeptics have put forward to explain the Robert the Doll phenomenon. I'm going to lay them all out so you can decide for yourself. Theory 1. The curse theory. This is the oldest and most cited explanation. The idea is that the Bahamian servant who gave Jean the doll infused it with a genuine spiritual curse or protective ward, either intentionally as revenge for how she was treated by the wealthy Otto family, or unintentionally as a byproduct of folk magic practices tied to her culture. Believers in this theory point to the consistency of the reported effects. Bad luck specifically tied to disrespecting the doll, rather than random unrelated hauntings, as evidence that something was deliberately bound to the object itself. Critics of this theory point out that the specific details of what the servant did, or even her name, were never reliably documented at the time. Almost everything about her role comes from secondhand family stories told decades after the fact, filtered through early 1900s framing of Caribbean spiritual practices that wasn't always accurate or respectful to begin with. In other words, we don't actually know what, if anything, she did. Theory 2. The possessed object, residual spirit. Theory. This is the classic paranormal investigator explanation that a spirit, potentially the servant's, potentially something unrelated to her at all, became attached to the doll and has remained tied to it for over a century, growing more agitated the more the doll gets handled, moved, or disrespected. Paranormal investigators who've been granted access to Robert have used EVP, electronic voice phenomena, equipment and claim to capture responses, including growls and whispered single words, when asking Robert direct questions. Skeptics note that EVP evidence is notoriously unreliable since equipment can pick up radio interference, ambient background noise, or the investigator's own suggestible interpretation of static as a word. No EVP recording associated with Robert has ever been independently verified under controlled conditions. Theory 3. The psychological childhood trauma. Theory. This theory doesn't require anything supernatural at all. It focuses on Gene Otto himself. Some biographers and historians have pointed out that Gene grew up in a strict, emotionally distant household, and that his intense attachment to Robert may reflect a child using a toy as a coping mechanism, a stand-in companion, even a scapegoat for behavior he knew would get him punished. Robert did it is something almost every child says about something: a toy, an imaginary friend, a sibling. Under this theory, Gene's adult attachment to the doll, keeping him in his own chair well into adulthood, reflects unresolved childhood trauma or even a mental health condition that caused him to treat the doll as a genuine companion rather than evidence of anything paranormal happening in the house at all. Reports of the doll's voice answering Gene may simply be Gene doing voices for the doll himself, the way many children, and some adults, do. This theory doesn't explain the accounts from other people, like the family's 10-year-old daughter decades later, who had no knowledge of Gene's private relationship with the doll. Believers in the paranormal theories point to that gap as the psychological theory's biggest weakness. Theory 4. Suggestion, expectation, and pareidolia. This is the leading skeptical explanation for the museum-era phenomena specifically. Robert's reputation precedes him. Every visitor who walks up to his case already knows his story. They've heard he's cursed before they ever look at his face. Psychologists who study belief and perception point out that this kind of prior expectation dramatically increases the likelihood that someone will interpret something ambiguous, a flickering camera, a headache, an unrelated bad day, as evidence of a curse they were primed to expect. There's also pareidolia, our brain's tendency to find faces and emotional expressions in random patterns, especially in things that already resemble faces, like a hand-painted antique doll. Under bright museum lighting versus dim afternoon light, a static painted expression really can appear to shift without anything about the doll physically changing at all. Under this theory, the letters, the cursed photos, the bad luck stories, none of it comes from Robert doing anything. It comes from thousands of visitors' brains doing exactly what human brains are wired to do around something they've been told is dangerous. Theory 5. The hoax tourism marketing theory. The most cynical and most frequently proposed theory is that Robert's modern reputation was deliberately cultivated, at least in part, to drive tourism. Key West's economy depends heavily on tourism, and a real-life Chucky with a documented century-old backstory is an enormously effective attraction. Under this theory, the museum has every incentive to keep the legend alive, to encourage visitors to write letters, to publicize stories of cursed photographs, and to lean into the mystery rather than debunk it, regardless of whether any individual incident is genuine. This doesn't necessarily mean every account is fabricated. It means the ecosystem around Robert, media appearances, ghost hunting show segments, gift shop merchandise, has a financial motive to amplify the scariest possible version of the story, which makes it difficult to separate authentic testimony from legend building. Theory 6. The simplest explanation. Selective memory. The last theory isn't as dramatic as the others, but statisticians and skeptics bring it up constantly. With hundreds of thousands of visitors over multiple decades, some percentage of them are statistically guaranteed to experience a bad day, a car problem, or an illness shortly after their visit, purely by coincidence. The museum doesn't receive letters from the overwhelming majority of visitors who photographed Robert and had a completely normal week afterward. It only receives letters from the small percentage who happen to have something go wrong. And it's those letters that get read aloud, published, and turned into proof. This is a well-documented cognitive bias called confirmation bias, and some researchers argue it alone could account for the entire modern letter phenomenon without anything paranormal happening at all. So, is Robert cursed by an act of real folk magic in 1904? Is he a residual haunting? Is he a mirror reflecting the psychological trauma of a lonely boy? Or is he just an old, well-marketed doll that 100 years of ghost stories have transformed into something more than the sum of his parts? Here's what we do know, without dispute. Robert Eugene Otto really existed. He really was given a doll as a child by a servant in his household. He really did have an unusually intense, lifelong attachment to that doll into adulthood. A family really did give the doll to a museum after their daughter reported terrifying experiences with it. And the museum really does receive hundreds of apology letters every year from visitors across the world, all telling remarkably similar stories. Whatever is actually happening, spiritual, psychological, or purely statistical, Robert has done something very few objects in the world have managed to do. He's made thousands of adults who don't believe in curses ask for one anyway, just in case. He's sitting in that glass case right now, in his sailor suit, watching the door. If you ever find yourself in Key West, maybe just ask him first. If this is the kind of case that keeps you up thinking, let me know in the comments which theory you believe, the curse, the trauma, or the tourism trap. And if you want the next deep dive delivered straight to you, subscribe, because we're covering a new haunted object case very soon. Stay safe out there, and maybe don't take that photo.